Wagner. Wagner forces are a private military organization that operates as an unofficial army. It includes thousands of fighters who have taken part in some of the most dangerous modern wars without their name appearing in official statements or on maps. In this video, we reveal the full story of Wagner, from its birth in the shadows to its expansion across battlefields around the world, and how it transformed from a secret tool used by the state when needed into an independent force that spiraled out of control and ended in a tragic fate. The Wagner Group emerged at a pivotal historical moment when Russia was redefining its power projection abroad without engaging in direct, overt confrontations. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow inherited fractured influence and a military burdened by internal and external political and economic constraints. During this phase, the concept of utilizing unofficial entities as tools for missions that the state did not wish to publicly account for began to take shape. According to various Western and Russian media reports, Wagner was never officially registered as a branch of the Russian military, yet in practice it was never far from it. The name itself is reportedly derived from a call sign used by one of the group's founders, inspired by the famous German composer. However, behind this cultural moniker, an armed force was forming that differed significantly from traditional militaries. This force does not answer to public military service laws, nor is it held accountable within standard legal frameworks. Therein lies its danger, as it operates in the gray zone between the state and organized crime. Initially, Wagner participated in limited, low-profile conflicts, particularly in regions that received little media coverage. Investigative reports suggest their early missions involved protection, securing facilities, and supporting local factions aligned with Russian interests. This role did not remain limited for long. As regional conflicts escalated, Wagner began to be deployed in increasingly complex and high-stakes operations. Syria served as one of the first major theaters where the Wagner name surfaced with relative clarity. There, according to multiple media accounts, the group engaged in combat operations parallel to the regular army. Wagner's primary advantage was its ability to move swiftly with minimal political cost to Moscow. If an operation succeeded, it was tacitly recorded as a strategic achievement. If it failed, ties could be easily denied, framing the matter as nothing more than independent contractors. This model provided Russia with an effective tool to expand its influence without bearing direct legal consequences. Over time, Wagner's reputation began to solidify, not as a formal force, but as a blunt instrument that operates outside traditional rules of engagement. Human rights organizations have linked the group to allegations of serious violations in conflict zones, claims that, while not always proven in court, have recurred enough to spark international concern. What defines Wagner is not just what they do, but the persistent ambiguity surrounding their structure, funding, and leadership. Funding, according to press reports, stemmed from a mix of security contracts and economic concessions, particularly in the energy and mineral sectors. This meant that weaponry was not the sole end, but a means to control resources. In Africa, Wagner began playing a different role, blending security, politics, and economics. Their intervention there was often presented at the request of fragile governments seeking rapid protection without the political conditions imposed by the West. However, according to analysts, the price was not just financial, but a long-term toll on national sovereignty. Thus, Wagner evolved from a mere shadow tool into an influential player in multi-continental conflicts. With this expansion, questions intensified regarding who truly controls this force. Is it an undeclared arm of the Kremlin, or an independent entity serving its own interests under the state's umbrella? The answer was never clear, and perhaps it was never intended to be. As Wagner's activities expanded beyond Russia's borders, the line between the group and the state grew increasingly blurred and complex. According to press reports and investigative inquiries, Wagner evolved from a mere executor of undisclosed orders into an entity possessing significant decision-making autonomy on the ground. This shift was no accident. It was the direct result of a growing reliance on the group in regions where Moscow preferred to avoid an official presence. In Syria, for instance, Wagner's role transcended simple defense as they spearheaded direct assaults and fierce battles over strategic locations. Western outlets reported that in some cases, the group secured contracts granting them a percentage of oil and gas revenues in exchange for their combat services. This model essentially transformed warfare into an economic enterprise, inextricably linking the continuation of conflict to the pursuit of profit. In Africa, this model expanded even further and more overtly. In nations struggling with weak state institutions, Wagner presented itself as a swift and effective security savior. However, beneath this rhetoric, human rights reports indicate that their presence was often accompanied by violent crackdowns, extrajudicial killings, and grave violations. According to international organizations, these accusations were not isolated incidents, but rather a recurring pattern. Wagner did not operate under a traditional military doctrine. Instead, they functioned with a mindset of absolute control, frequently placing civilians directly in harm's way. Despite this, some governments continued to cooperate with them, driven by a desperate need for immediate security at any cost. Consequently, Wagner became a political actor as much as a military one. This burgeoning influence eventually began to stir unease even within Russia itself. Analysts argued that a force operating outside the formal military chain of command posed a long-term risk. Yet, as long as the results served strategic interests, these concerns were largely ignored. The turning point arrived with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. There, Wagner was no longer relegated to the fringes, but was thrust into the very heart of the conflict. They engaged in the most brutal clashes and, according to independent reports, suffered massive casualties. Their combat style was ruthless, relying on direct frontal assaults and exhausting the enemy regardless of the human cost. This approach, as noted by media reports, fueled intense tensions with the regular military leadership. Disagreements that were once managed behind closed doors began to spill into the public eye. Unprecedented public statements revealed a power struggle within the war machine itself. Wagner was no longer content with just following orders. They began demanding recognition and overt support. At this juncture, the group transitioned from a useful tool into a potential political liability. The state that created the shadow began to fear what had emerged from it. Observers noted that this escalation signaled a deep flaw in the model of relying on irregular forces. A power built on plausible deniability cannot be easily contained once it demands its steed. A shift occurred, where Wagner was no longer just a name in intelligence reports, but starred the spotlight. The fragile balance began to collapse, ushering in a new and more dangerous phase, a catalyst for internal instability. The question was no longer what Wagner was doing abroad, but rather, what happens when the shadow force returns to confront its creator? As the war in Ukraine entered its second month, the image of the Russian military began to crack before the eyes of the world. Progress was not matching expectations, and casualties were far higher than the Kremlin had anticipated. At this precise moment, the name Wagner emerged with unprecedented force. They were no longer just a support group, but had transformed into the spearhead on the bloodiest fronts. The city of Bakhmut became the clearest symbol of this transformation, a long, grueling battle of attrition that turned into an open hell. While regular forces faltered, Wagner fighters were thrust into the front lines without pause.
Through months of fighting, entire neighborhoods were erased, and names vanished without ever being recorded. According to multiple sources, Wagner fought with a logic entirely different from traditional militaries. Progress at any cost, even if that cost meant the loss of thousands of fighters. This approach created a deep rift with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Regular officers viewed Wagner as a reckless force, while Prigozhin saw the military leadership as failures. For the first time in modern Russian history, an individual closely tied to the war effort went public with these internal disputes. Through videos and direct statements, accusations of corruption and mismanagement surfaced, a language unfamiliar in a system that typically does not tolerate such defiance. Prigozhin was no longer addressing the leadership from behind the curtain. He was speaking directly to the camera. This behavior was not merely an expression of anger, it was a message of power, signaling that Wagner was no longer entirely dependent on the state. With a vast number of fighters, readily available weaponry, and undeniable field experience, the group felt emboldened. However, this sense of power was a double-edged sword, and every escalatory step brought Prigozhin closer to the point of no return. The state that had allowed him to thrive would not accept his transformation into an independent player. Over time, support began to wane, ammunition was delayed, supplies dwindled, and pressure mounted. Prigozhin interpreted this as deliberate betrayal, and his reaction was more dangerous than any battle he had previously fought. In a pivotal moment, he announced a withdrawal from certain fronts, and then, in an unprecedented development, turned his compass towards the Russian heartland. Convoys moved, roads opened, and a heavy silence hung over Moscow. The world watched in disbelief as a force that had participated in foreign wars stood at the gates of the capital. It was not a traditional rebellion, but a demonstration of power and its limits. The message was clear. This was not just a private military company. However, the response came swifter and more strategic than many expected. Without a direct confrontation, the situation was contained through promises, temporary understandings, and an official narrative that reordered the scene. The mutiny stopped, but the damage was done. A red line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the way things were. From that night on, Wagner's fate hung in the balance, a force without clear political cover and a leader who had become more of a liability than an asset. History shows that regimes may forgive, but they never forget, and the coming days held the answer.
Following the failed mutiny, Prigozhin was no longer the man who spoke with such bravado before the cameras. His movements became restricted, his rhetoric shifted, and his tone lost its former edge. While Wagner was not officially disbanded, it had practically entered a stage of slow expiration. The state began dismantling it quietly, without fanfare or direct pronouncements. Some fighters were integrated into the Russian army, others were sent back to the prisons they had temporarily escaped, and the most dangerous elements were pushed away from the spotlight toward Africa. There, in a landscape devoid of cameras, questions, or clear red lines, Prigozhin attempted to project the image of a leader who had weathered the storm. He posted videos discussing new projects and expansion across the continent, yet observers noticed a stark difference: fewer guards, fewer appearances, and significantly less confidence. The man who had challenged the most powerful military establishment in his country found himself alone, as even his closest allies began to distance themselves. Russian history is seldom kind to those who miscalculate, and in August 2023, the news everyone anticipated but few dared to voice finally arrived. A private jet crashed on Russian soil, carrying Yevgeny Prigozhin, Dmitry Utkin, and several top Wagner commanders. There were no survivors, no convincing explanations, and perhaps no real need for clarification. The message was clearer than any official statement. Those who challenge the center are erased from the margins.
Prigozhin's death was more than just an accident. It was the conclusion of an entire chapter of undeclared warfare. Within days, Wagner began to disintegrate publicly. Headquarters were shuttered, accounts were frozen, and the name, Wagner, started to fade. Yet the legacy remained. Thousands of fighters trained in unrestrained violence, networks of interest stretching from the Middle East to the heart of Africa, and resources whose control remains a mystery. The question is no longer whether Wagner is over, but rather who inherited it. Numerous reports speak of new formations under different names, same methods, same mindset, but with less famous faces. The experiment proved successful in terms of influence and profit, making its repetition merely a matter of time. The story of Wagner is not just the story of a military, it is a tale of how money and war can forge a power outside the state, and how the state eventually returns to break that power when it grows too large. In today's world, wars are no longer fought solely by national armies, but by corporations, mercenaries, and hidden interests. Wagner was the most vivid model of this transformation, spanning from Ukraine to Syria and Africa, and finally back to the Russian heartland. It was a journey short in duration, but saturated with blood, money, and betrayal. The end was inevitable, even if the timing was uncertain, and the lesson is clear to anyone who understands history. Power without legitimacy is temporary, and influence without cover is destined to fall. The name Wagner may have ended, but the concept it represented remains alive, and that, precisely, is what makes the story so haunting.